All right, so this is going to be probably the least technical talk of the night, because I'm really here to win hearts and minds, not to teach you how to code. I'm teaching you how to be better developers, right? So this is really about how to write commit messages like you give a darn about what you're doing, and why that's important, right? So first I'm going to start with a quote from Harold Abelson. Programs must be written for people to read, and only incidentally for machines to execute. Right? So reading and understanding code, being able to grasp concepts in your minds is very important for our ability to be successful as developers. So last year at DevOps Days DFW, I introduced a corollary quote, so if you want to write this down and take pictures, it's totally fine. So pull requests and commits must be written for people to read, and only incidentally to fulfill the needs of a particular user story. Okay, so in other words, the commits that you write tell the story behind the code. If you're writing great code, which I'm sure everyone here is, of course, writing amazing, tight, beautiful code, it's clear what the code is doing. You've got well-named methods, you've got comments where they're appropriate, that's awesome. But what the comments don't tell you is why, right? Comments tell you maybe what it's doing, but it doesn't tell you the motivations that went into it, the thought processes, the context behind what led you to write the code in the way that you wrote it. So this context really is important, right? So understanding what you were thinking when you wrote the code and capturing it that while you're doing it is super important, because how many times have you looked at code that you wrote 6 months ago or yesterday and said, what the what? What was I even thinking, right? And so, like, it's about being a good steward to yourself, let alone everyone else that you work with, right? So the important thing is to capture this context at the time that you're making those decisions, right? Because no one's going to remember it later. If you're looking back a year later, would you rather have a well thought out commit history or giant unexplained commits with tons of changes and no rhyme or reason to why it was done? And I think hopefully the answer is obvious and we all agree. If you don't, I'll speak to you personally afterwards in the parking lot. The rest of this talk assumes that you're using Git, because those are my examples. It doesn't have to be Git, but most people use that nowadays. And that you probably have some sort of pull or merge request workflow in the work that you're doing. That's fairly common these days. And I think both of those things are awesome. I think pull and merge request workflows are really good for helping you be a better developer and helping socialize the work that you're doing amongst your team. So like any good technologist that's doing something, I didn't bother to actually write most of this presentation. I went out to Google and found a great example of code commits. So code reuse right here. So this is from, Chris Beams wrote this a while ago about writing good Git commits. And so I just think it's great. I really can't improve on it. So, and the other thing is if you follow this particular format, most like GitHub and GitLab all understand this format and will use it when it's presenting your commits to you and your pull requests to you. So the first thing is create a subject line separated from your body with a blank line and have those be 50 characters on the subject line. Capitalize it and don't end the subject line with the periods. That's all just kind of formatting stuff. Right, so the subject line should be something that at the end of the day, when you read, when this commit is pulled into the code base, it will blank. Right, so fill in the blank with what you're trying to communicate in less than 50 characters about what that commit does. If you can't summarize it in 50 characters, your commit is too big. Right, you've done too much work, which is a whole other talk, which we're not going to get into now. So the second part is wrap the body at 72 characters and include detailed explanatory text where it's appropriate about the context of why you made the decisions. You don't necessarily, you're probably going to reference some JIRA story or some pivotal story, so you don't need to explain what the story actually was, but maybe you made particular decisions or you had particular thought process about why you used a particular algorithm versus another one. Capture that stuff here. And again, we're explaining what and why versus how. So just like programs should be written for people to read, commit should be written so that the code is easy to review, right? That's important because I'm sure anyone, who all does like pull request, merge request workflows? So a lot of people, right? So if you're familiar with those things, you often see something like this, right? So here's a commit adding a new controller method. But if I actually look at what happened, I made a bunch more changes, so it appears that something else is going on besides this. So I'm going to jump over to GitHub and look at this one in particular, right? So this is GitHub, this is the pull request. So files change 8, right? So I added a new controller method, I changed 8 files. Oh my goodness. Sorry. Sorry. So GitHub, 8 files changed, 419 additions, 306 additions, right? So clearly I did much more, like I changed this whole method. Right? That's the same method, I didn't add it new. Right? So now as a code reviewer, like where do I even start? Right? I don't understand what you're doing here. So let's look at an example of something that has well thought out commit comments and tells a story, right? Because that's what these things should be, is stories that explain how you got from point A to point B. So I started by formatting the code according to proper code style guidelines. So I just went into IntelliJ and said, format all the code, committed it. So I can go in and look at that commit and see that's all that happened, right? So as a code reviewer, I can quickly breeze through this and say, I totally understand what happened there. And then I did some small refactoring and code updates. There were some extra lines, some unnecessary comments. So that's very clear. And again, you get the idea. So each of these told the step of the story until finally, the last commit is the introduction of the new controller endpoint, which all fits on one page. Right? So as a code reviewer now, I have a very clear, this is the salient information. This is what I'm looking at to make sure does the job that I'm supposed to be doing. The rest of it isn't noise, right? Those other things are important, like refactoring is important and you should do it, but you shouldn't do it in such a way that it makes the pull request not understandable, unintelligible. So accomplishing this level of clarity with your commit message and pull requests takes practice, right? Like anything else you do, this is not necessarily going to come easy when you first start doing this, if this isn't already a habit of yours. Especially this idea of structuring your commits in such a way that they tell a story. And you can start at number 1 and end at number 6 and understand the story that's being told. So luckily Git has some tools to help make this better. So I'm going to use the R word, which some people are really scared about, which is rebase, right? So some people don't like rebasing. It's cool, it's whatever, but it's a very powerful tool that you should understand. It's like being Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. Rebasing is exactly the same way. You can totally mess up your code base unless you know what you're doing. But knowing what you're doing allows you to do things like reorder your commits. If you get to the end of your job and you've done everything, and you're like, cool, this is ready to go. Oh, wait a minute, I wish I rename that method because it's not so great. You can rename the method, take that commit, and put it back in the right order so it makes sense in the story you're trying to tell. So I'm not going to go into how to do that, you can look it up. But the most important thing is that you should care about this stuff, right? That's why I'm trying to win your hearts and minds. Like, you should understand why this is important and embrace this, right? Because every one of these commits is that love letter we send to ourselves in the future, or it's the hate mail that we send to ourselves, or most likely our colleagues, because we've gone on to somewhere else. So don't do that. So the other thing is that this is a self-reinforcing thing, right? Like, we're always told to work in small increments and commit as you work. If you train yourself to write your code in such a way that it can be understood for a pull request, you're going to start writing code in smaller increments, and then you're going to write better code for pull requests, and it's a virtuous cycle that goes on with how you do stuff. So that's it. I'm David Ayers. Thank you.